As well. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Dr. David Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to begin with a quote that was offered to, some words of wisdom that were offered to us in the Select Committee when we heard submissions on this bill. We've heard some great submissions this evening in the debate this afternoon. There has been some light-hearted contributions and we've had some fun with it. But there's a point that needs to be made, and this was made by a senior partner at one of the large law firms in town in relation to this tax legislation. And he said that basically this bill moves legislation from one area to another. It is a total waste of Parliament's time, and that is a direct quote. He said words or words very similar than that that I wrote down immediately. He was concerned, Mr. Speaker, that we were concerning ourselves with matters that were not of significant importance, that most of these matters have already been addressed, and that in fact what we were really doing was shuffling paper in this Parliament. And I think that this speaks to a wider point, which is around the government's priorities and around its agenda in the area of financial management and tax change and so on. We have a government that is not pushing the big ideas. Instead, it's focused on changing legislation from one act to the other because it needs to be seen to be doing something, Mr. Speaker. In its current form, it is largely window dressing. Another point made by the same submitter was that this legislation, which has capital adequacy criteria, will tend, because of that, to be more stringent in practice than the advertised minimum capital of 8%, and that will push some unusual behaviours. It may well cause a perverse incentive to loan heavily in the mortgage market and to drag capital away from productive areas of the economy. Now, Mr. Chair, if that indeed is true, and if that perverse incentive plays out, what we have here is something that goes in the opposite direction to pro-growth policies. And indeed, that would be consistent with what the government's done so far. This is a government with the worst economic growth record in 50 years, Mr. Speaker. And in part that is because where there is real change to be made, they are shying away. Instead, in this bill, we are dealing with matters that are largely already dealt with. Now, the previous speaker mentioned the need to strike a balance in terms of making things clear for investors about risk, and also in terms of making sure that there was appropriate regulation in place. And I want to agree with that member. That member sometimes has some wise ideas, and this was one of them. I think that balance does need to be struck, and we do need to be wary of creating perverse incentives, though, and stepping too far away. The credit unions, in their submission, said that they felt that it was ironic that the regulation that's being introduced is going to be borne by the firms that didn't collapse. They were concerned that in their case, this regulation was a bit tight. They all have skin in the game in their cooperative business model, and they felt that perhaps this legislation went a bit far in terms of regulation rather than in terms of signalling to businesses what the risks were so they could make up the decisions for themselves about where to invest their monies. And I think it's worth taking that into account as we progress this bill. Now, the Labour Party will support this bill because really it is, although ultimately window dressing, there are one or two things that tidies up that can and should be tidied up. So we're not going to oppose that, certainly. We are concerned that there is integrity within financial markets, which is ultimately the purpose of this bill. And that goes to the confidence in government as a regulator. And we know that that is something highly desirable, indeed necessary for the future of our country. And Mr Cosgrove, earlier in the debate, made a germane point about confidence in the government as a regulator, and about the finance sector and the government's handling of the Crown Retail Deposit Guarantee Scheme. And that discussion is very germane to this bill, because here we have people taking deposits in a scheme which did stop a roll on banks. It did stop flight of finance to Australia, but it's clear from the report that we got from the Auditor General, which we asked the Minister of Finance about, that a full investigation has not yet been conducted into the avoidable losses of that scheme, that are really the responsibility of this government. And the avoidable losses of that scheme have been estimated at somewhere between $100 million and $500 million, Mr. Speaker. That is the biggest loss of Crown funds, the biggest preventable loss of Crown funds in the history of New Zealand. It seems to me... We did invite Bill English to come and talk about it. He has so far resisted any suggestion that he should look into this and answer for the fact that we have potentially the biggest loss of taxpayer funds in New Zealand history, far bigger than INSIS or any other scandal, with additional losses as a result of mishandling the scheme. There were no reports for 3 or 4 months on the additional losses that were incurred. We know, for example, that there was an increase in South Canterbury Finance's balance sheet in terms of the risk that they were carrying of 25% during that period, that there was no effective Crown monitoring of the scheme. We know that there was a 10 times increase in another finance company's loan book, all risky loans, and this is all as a consequence, we would argue, of the mismanagement of the scheme, the failure of the Treasury to intervene after it had written effectively an open cheque on behalf of the taxpayer to preserve taxpayer interest, but it did not monitor effectively beyond that. And this is something that we feel needs to be investigated fully. This gets to the integrity of New Zealand's position within financial markets, confidence in the government as a regulator, which is what this bill is designed to do, to ensure. And we would argue that that is a more poignant and pressing concern than the matters raised in this bill, Mr. Chair. So when I want to talk further about this bill, we can look at some of the other things that it does do. And one of the things it does is it develops and completes work that the Labor government started. So although it is tinkering, it's tinkering in a way that is consistent with addressing the concerns that were raised in the finance sector when we were faced with financial company collapses and the world financial crisis. New Zealand faced those challenges, and we set out, the Labor government introduced, for example, the Crown Retail Deposit Guarantee Scheme to ensure that Kiwis could invest with confidence. It's not the scheme itself that we find fault with, it's the handling and management and monitoring that the Auditor General has pointed to, where the Auditor General has found clear fault. It's that handling of the scheme which has not been addressed or investigated thoroughly. And so that is very hard for New Zealanders to have confidence in the government as a regulator if it doesn't address those bigger issues and seems to be focused on addressing smaller issues around the finance sector. And it's 3 years as well until the government got around to the second part of this reform package, which was started by the Labor government. Since the first reading of this bill, another year has passed, and we've got to ask why, if this legislation is so important, it's taken so long to get through the House. This is a government that seems to be out of ideas. It's not facing up to the reality that we as a country need pro-growth tax policies, we need research and development policies, we need proper savings policies, Mr. Chair, and we need monetary policy reform to ensure that exporters are supported so that we can start earning more than we're spending as a country, so that we can address the real problems with our economy rather than tinkering around the edges as this bill attempts to do. So in closing, while Labor will support this bill, we take seriously the words of wisdom from submitters in the legal companies that told us this is really a waste of Parliament's time. We, as a Labor Party, if we were in government, would be doing more serious things to ensure the confidence in the finance sector, which is so important to our future as a country.
I call Maggie Barry.
Thank you.